Have you ever heard the sound of a heartbeat that doesn't belong to a human? One stormy night by Silver Creek, Walter Granger, a former Hollywood sound engineer who lost his wife and daughter, captured something on tape. A sound so deep, so raw, it echoed like a breath from the woods. A creature breathing, hidden in rain and shadow. But it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wild animal. It was something else. Wounded, trembling, with eyes full of fear. And something else. Understanding. Walt saved it. The creature came back the next morning, leaving a bundle of dry grass next to his old dog. A gesture, a peace offering, from that moment on, between a grieving man, a loyal dog, and a being the world refused to believe in. Something was born. Something beyond words, beyond species. A family shaped by kindness. This story isn't about monsters. It's about redemption, about the invisible ties between creatures who've lost everything, and yet choose to stay. Walter once believed silence was the end, but in his final days, he left behind one last recording. At the very end, 2 soft knocks, a sound no one can explain, except those who believe. So here's our question to you. Where are you watching from? How far can this story travel? And who else out there still believes there's more to this world than just what we see? If this story touched you, let it echo a little further. Like, subscribe, and help us build a quiet corner of the internet where kindness meets mystery. From us to you, wherever you are, thank you for listening. In the spring of 1993, when the snow finally let go of the mountain's ribs and the pines stopped creaking from the weight, Walter Granger sat alone in his cabin above Silver Creek Lake and listened to the silence that wasn't really silence at all. The man was 59 and looked older, though his hands still held steady when threading old cassette tape. His cabin stood a mile from the nearest trailhead, tucked into a bend where fog liked to gather like breath on glass. On most days, the wind passed through the needles like a whisper that had forgotten its words. On most nights, the only company he kept was a one-eyed shepherd dog named Baxter, who lay curled by the wood stove, the way old dogs do, half asleep, half remembering. Walter had once been a sound engineer for movie studios in Los Angeles. He had held boom mics in war films, edited whispers for thrillers, recorded footsteps that didn't belong to anyone real. But after 1988, after the crash that took his wife and daughter in the middle of a rainy California night, none of it made sense anymore. He left everything behind, his job, his house in Laurel Canyon, the city's neon hum, and moved to Idaho with just a truckload of equipment and a dog that was already going blind in one eye. Folks in town remembered him vaguely. That guy who never talked much, who asked the librarian for books about bird calls and brought his own headphones to the post office. Every night without fail, Walter would carry a battered reel-to-reel tape recorder, a Nagra 4 he'd used back in '75, down to the lake shore. He'd prop it on a rock under the eaves of a cedar tree and sit there for hours, wrapped in a waxed canvas coat, letting the machine do its work. Rain on leaves, owls calling from somewhere deep, frogs waking slowly, the hush between gusts of wind. He called it the rest of the real world, the part not recorded for anyone else's entertainment, the part that simply was. That early spring night, the sky was low and pearled with mist. Rain fell in gentle sheets, steady but soft, like the lake itself had lifted into the air and decided to return drop by drop. Walter sipped lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos, ran his fingers over the cold metal of the recorder, and adjusted the gain knob slightly to catch the quiet better. Baxter lay beside him under the porch, ears twitching occasionally, but otherwise still. The smell of wet earth and pine resin filled the air. At 2:17 a.m., the ground trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. Not quite. It was the kind of vibration that comes from something alive, something enormous. The sound that followed was not a roar. It wasn't a scream or a growl either. It was deep, so deep it seemed to pass through the bones instead of the ears. A low, sustained rumble, closer to thunder dragged out by hand. Walter froze. His fingers paused on the recorder. Baxter sat up and whimpered once, a sound he hadn't made in years. The rain didn't stop, but for a moment, it didn't seem to matter. The sound lasted barely 4 seconds. Then, silence again. Real this time. Even the frogs had stopped. Walter waited until morning to play back the tape. He sat at his desk, the machine spooling forward, headphones cupping his ears like a stethoscope to the forest's heart. Rain, rustle of branches, a single owl call. And then, that same low groan, just as he remembered it. But something else too. 3 pulses, bass-heavy, slow, boom, 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 like heartbeats made of thunder. Faint but clear, like someone had knocked on the chest of the world. He rewound, played it again, and again. Each time those 3 pulses echoed through his chest like a warning, or maybe an invitation. Outside, Baxter stood stiff-legged on the porch, staring toward the tree line. Not barking, just watching. Walter followed his gaze. The fog was burning off slowly, exposing patches of wet ground, needles slick with dew, and the faintest shape of something large having passed. There were no footprints. Not exactly. But when Walter stepped down the stairs and looked closely, he saw it. On the floorboard of the porch, half in shadow, half dried in the sun, was the imprint of a massive hand. Not a paw, not a bear's track. 5 fingers, the palm wide as a dinner plate. The wood stained with mud, smeared like it had pressed down and then lifted, slow and deliberate. Walter crouched, tracing the edges of it with the tip of a pen. It wasn't fresh. The rain had gotten to it. But it was there. Real. He touched it, then sniffed his fingers. The scent was sharp and metallic. Not like blood. Like rust. Like old iron soaked in pine sap. The dog whimpered behind him. He stood, crossed the gravel path to where the lake licked at the edge of the clearing, and stopped. Something glinted in the mud, right where the land met water. He bent down and picked it up. A thin metal tag, about the size of a belt buckle. Faded, worn smooth by time and weather, but still legible if held at the right angle. Harker Ranch, ID. Walter stared at it a long time. The name stirred nothing familiar in him, but the metal was cold and old, and felt like it had waited to be found. He slipped it into his coat pocket. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because he was afraid, though maybe he should have been, but because something inside him had started to hum again. Not the old kind of humming, not grief's dull static. Something else, something alert. He sat on the porch in the dark with the tape recorder running again, scanning the trees with his ears more than his eyes. The rain had stopped. The wind pressed lightly through the pine boughs. Nothing moved, but the air felt watched. He listened until dawn. In the recording from that night, he would later hear a new sound. Quiet, but steady. A long exhale, like breath passing through a hollow chamber. Like the mountain itself had sighed, and no one but Walter had noticed. He didn't tell anyone. Not the old woman at the general store, not the mailman who dropped off his tapes of bird calls once a week, not the game warden who drove past sometimes and waved without slowing. Walter wasn't a fool. He knew how people treated old men who started talking about voices in the woods, but he also knew what he heard. The next morning, there were no new prints, no more metal tags, just dew on the grass and Baxter sitting upright, ears aimed at the thicket as if waiting for something to return. Walter stood beside him and watched too, not hoping, not fearing, just waiting. And somewhere, in the belly of the forest, something breathed. The fog hadn't lifted. It pressed low against the trees like it meant to stay, hanging in torn veils between the trunks, clinging to mossy bark and wet branches. Walter Granger stood in his boots at the edge of the tree line, staring into it with a kind of quiet certainty. Something had passed through here. Not just once, not in a rush. There was a presence in the woods now, and it hadn't come to vanish. It had circled back. Baxter's ears twitched as he let out a low, steady whine. Not fear exactly. More like unease, like a whisper of something he didn't want to name. His tail hung still behind him, tip barely grazing the wet dirt. Walt tightened his grip on the handle of the old crowbar, one he'd used for years to pry up porch planks, now cold and damp in his hand. He hadn't meant to follow anything, but the stain in the grass just off the back steps had stopped him in his tracks that morning. A dark, drying trail, thin as a creek, but too still to be water. It led into the woods. He didn't call out. He didn't ask why. He just followed. The path wasn't a trail, but a slow weaving through dense underbrush, broken limbs, and low branches. His boots pressed soft into the ground, sinking with each step. The fog moved with him, brushing past his face like breath. The deeper he went, the thicker it grew. He moved quietly, not because he was hiding, but because some part of him understood instinctively. This wasn't a place for loud sounds. The air here listened back. Maybe half a mile in, he saw it. A snarl of saplings had bent under some enormous weight. A patch of pine needles was kicked aside in a wide drag. And then, just beyond the bend where two boulders leaned in on each other like sleeping giants, he saw the steel glint. A trap. Old style. Wide enough to catch a bear's leg. And it had. The creature was down, not dead, not unconscious, but caught. Its body was curled slightly on its side, breath ragged and sharp, mist rising off its fur like smoke from a house in winter. The trap had its leg, above the ankle, below the knee, clamped in rusted steel. The teeth of the thing were embedded deep, blood soaked into the ground in a slow, dark halo. But the creature wasn't growling. It wasn't even screaming. It was breathing. Just breathing, quick and panicked. Its shoulders heaved. The muscles along its back twitched and shivered. But its head was tilted away, tucked slightly beneath the rise of one huge shoulder, as if trying to disappear into itself. Its arms were long, human in form, but furred, elbows bent like a man shielding his ribs. Walter froze. He didn't breathe. He just stared. The creature looked nothing like a bear. It wasn't a gorilla. It wasn't anything he could name. But it was massive, over 8 feet if it stood. Broad across the chest. Coated in a shaggy mat of dark brown fur streaked with dried blood and mud. But what struck Walter more than the size or the trap or the blood was the posture. It was curled in fear and in pain. Not rage, not aggression. It wasn't baring its teeth. It was trembling. He took one slow step forward. The creature flinched, not like an animal startled, like something that had learned pain. He stepped again, closer this time. Baxter didn't bark. The dog was behind him, but silent. He turned once to check. Baxter was standing stiffly, head low, tail between his legs, eyes wide but locked onto the thing on the ground. And still, no sound. Walter knelt, keeping the crowbar in his hand but lowering it. The trap was old, the kind with a spring mechanism, tension wound tight and brutal. He'd seen it before, back when the Harper boys still had their hunting shop open. He looked closer and saw it. The faint H and arrow scratched into the hinge. Harper's steel. Damned rusted illegal traps, set without markers. He glanced at the creature. Its face still turned, but its breath, slower now. Like it knew he wasn't reaching for a gun. He moved the bar under the catch. It took both arms and all the weight of his back to pry it open. The trap springs groaned, and the metal screeched against itself, echoing sharp and ugly through the trees. The creature twitched, a soft grunt escaping as the pressure eased from its leg. And then it moved. Not fast, not lunging. It rolled slowly onto its good side, shifting weight from the injured limb, and half pulled, half dragged itself back. Its massive hand pushed against the mossy ground, fingers long and human-shaped, the pads wide and calloused. Its fur glistened in the faint light. It didn't bare teeth, didn't roar. Just watched him now, eyes half-shadowed, chest heaving. Walter backed away, gave it space, dropped the crowbar. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, the creature pushed itself upright, crouched low, one knee bent, the other dragging. It turned toward the thicket, looked back once, just once, and vanished into the fog. All that remained was the echo of its breath and the smell of rust and pine. Walter exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding it. He picked up the trap, blood still on the teeth. In the dirt beside it lay a spent bullet casing. .30 caliber, tarnished, fresh. He turned it in his hand. The copper was dull, smeared with blood. Not enough to kill, enough to panic. He pocketed it. The walk back felt longer. The fog followed him all the way to the cabin, slipping around the trees like a memory trying to stay close. Baxter padded behind him, still quiet. At the porch, Walter paused, looked back. Nothing but trees. Nothing but mist. That night the cabin felt too still. Even the wind had gone silent. He sat at his desk, flipped on the recorder, played back the reel from last night again. The one with the pulses, the one with the breath. And now, something new. Faint but clear. A sigh, drawn out and hollow, like air moving through stone. Not a howl, not a voice, just breath, long and aching. He closed his eyes, listened to it again. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded tired. The sun barely touched the ground behind Walter's cabin that morning, and yet something felt different in the way the light came through the trees. Not brighter, just slower, like it didn't want to wake the world too fast. He stepped outside barefoot, coffee in one hand, the steam rising steady as smoke, and Baxter followed close, nose to the boards. The dog's ears flicked. Then he stopped, head tilted. At the edge of the old fence line, just beyond the tall grass, a smear of dark red trailed across the ground, cutting through clover and dew. Walt squinted. It wasn't old blood. It hadn't turned brown yet. He stepped closer, feeling the earth soften under his feet. The trail led behind the cabin, toward the old goat shed. Just a wooden lean-to, really, abandoned for years. Roof sagging on one side where the last winter storm had taken half a beam. There, in the shadows, was a mass, curled in on itself, quiet, breathing. The creature had returned. It wasn't moving much, just a slow rise and fall of its chest, like the wind barely stirred inside it. One massive arm was draped over its wounded leg, the fur matted with blood, dark and sticky. Its head was pressed against the wall, shoulders hunched forward like it had collapsed there and never meant to be found. But it had come back. It had chosen this place. Walter didn't call out. He didn't move fast. He knelt near the opening, knees brushing pine needles, and just looked. The air smelled like iron and wet bark. A jay screeched somewhere far off. Baxter stood behind him, not growling, not barking, just watching. The creature's breathing hitched when Walt stepped closer, but it didn't bolt. Its chest shuddered once, then steadied again. Its fingers, long and thick, twitched slightly in the straw. Walter saw now that the wound was worse than it had looked in the woods. Swollen, crusted, parts of the fur split to raw skin. Infection had already started. He backed away, slow and steady. Went into the cabin, came out with a basin of warm salt water, a handful of dried yarrow leaves, a clean rag. Baxter followed him like a silent shadow. He knelt again and set the basin down, just far enough not to intrude, but close enough that the scent might carry. He didn't try to touch, just placed the cloth in the water, wrung it once, and laid it beside the creature's hand. For hours, nothing else happened. The creature didn't move. Walter stayed on the porch, drank his coffee cold, watched the trees bend with the wind. He didn't force it. He just waited. When he returned that evening, the cloth was gone. The basin tipped slightly, the water cloudy with dirt and blood. He exhaled slowly, not sure if it was relief or ache. The next few days moved like slow breath. Each morning, the creature was still there. Some days it shifted closer to the wall for shade. Some days it barely moved at all. Walter never tried to enter the shed. He simply left fresh water, soaked rags, boiled leaves. The wound was healing in fragments, scabbed in places, still open in others. But the creature no longer looked like it was drowning in pain. Its shoulders sat higher, its breathing more even. Its eyes, when they flicked toward him, didn't carry the same haze of fear. It avoided sunlight. That much became clear. Any time the sun passed overhead, it tucked itself deeper into the shadows. The sound of passing cars, rare but sharp on the distant ridge, made it tense, shoulders twitching. Once, when a semi blew its horn on a switchback, the creature let out a sound that wasn't quite a whimper but wasn't rage either. It was memory. Sharp, involuntary. Walter recognized that kind of sound. He'd made it himself once, 5 years ago, alone in the dark. When the voicemail from the coroner had played out in a whisper and his knees gave out beside the answering machine, he didn't speak to the creature, didn't name it out loud. But one afternoon, while sweeping the porch, he whispered it under his breath. Hollow. Not because of what it looked like, but because of how its breath sounded in the silence. Like wind through an empty canyon. Like something sacred and wounded all at once. That name stayed with him. He began to leave food. Not meat, but boiled root vegetables, some berries, old oats. Most of it went untouched. Sometimes he'd find it rearranged into a pile, moved from one side of the shed to the other, as if it had been examined but left alone. But the water always disappeared. The rags came back stained. And once, he found the yarrow laid out carefully on a flat rock, not eaten, but kept. Late one night, he woke to the sound of movement. Not alarm, not crashing, just movement. He looked out the window and saw Baxter wasn't in his usual spot by the hearth. The front door was half ajar. The wind had stilled. He stepped out into the darkness barefoot, the cold boards creaking under his weight. The dog was outside, sitting perfectly still. Next to him, not touching but close enough to feel the warmth, was Hollow. The creature was crouched low, arms resting on bent knees, head angled down. Eyes not on the man, but on the dog. Between them was a pile of dried grass and clover, bunched tight like a crude bedding offering. The same kind goats used to bed in. The same Walt had tossed years ago into that shed when he used to raise animals. He didn't interrupt. He just watched. And for the first time since that trap had snapped shut in the woods, Hollow looked whole again. Not healed, not safe, but not hiding either. By morning, Hollow was gone again. Not far, just back into the trees. But Baxter sat by the door all day, ears alert, as if waiting. Walter couldn't stop thinking about the metal tag. He pulled it from his drawer, wiped it clean. Harker Ranch, ID. The letters were stamped, not engraved. Industrial, impersonal. He spent hours at the library in town the next day, flipping through old property records and archived newsprint. The Harker name came up in dusty clippings from the late 60s, a private animal training facility, supposedly used by a traveling circus for off-season housing. Shut down after complaints of neglect, licensing violations, animal escapes. No photos, just paragraphs. His hands shook slightly as he read the last line of one article. Several unaccounted-for animals believed to have fled into adjacent woodland. Tracking unsuccessful. No follow-up investigation conducted. He folded the page gently, slipped it into his coat. That evening he brought a small wooden board to the clearing behind the cabin. Sat cross-legged. Waited for nothing in particular. Then he did something new. He clapped twice. Sharp, clear, palms flat. Just 2 beats. A pause. Silence. He didn't expect a reply. Didn't even know why he'd done it. But as the light began to drain from the sky and the shadows thickened between the pines, there came an echo. Not from the trees directly, from somewhere deeper. 2 soft, low thuds. Not hands. Something broader, but deliberate. It wasn't mimicry. It was recognition. Something had remembered. And something had chosen to answer. By June, the rain had grown bolder. No longer the shy spring drizzles that vanished by noon. It came down in heavy curtains now, soaking the hills, weighing down the cedar limbs, bleeding through the soil like something the earth was trying to forget. The lake swelled at its edges. The trees leaned closer. Walter sat on the porch with Baxter asleep at his feet, both listening to the sound of it. Not just the rain itself, but the way it moved through the landscape. Everything was louder now. Water in the gutters, gravel shifting, the low hum of something building behind the mountains. People in town had started talking again. Not about Walter, no one bothered him much, but about the hills, about strange sounds echoing through the timber, echoes that didn't belong to any animal they knew. Some swore it was just the storm playing tricks on the cliffs. Others, half drunk at the bar off Route 95, whispered it was something else. Walt didn't say a word. He just listened. That was always his way. One morning, Baxter barked. Not his usual half-hearted huff, but sharp, insistent. Walt stepped outside, barefoot on wet boards, and saw the dog standing rigid near the edge of the path. His tail was low, his body tense. Walt followed his gaze. Just beyond the blackberry bramble, tucked low in the fern bed along the trail, a trap. Iron jaws wide, clean, fresh, meant for something big. Walter stared at it for a long moment before he reached down with a stick and triggered it. The jaws snapped shut with a crack like a gunshot. He flinched anyway. That night, thunder stayed far off in the distance. Too tired to cross the mountains, but the air was thick with something that didn't pass. Walt sat by the recorder and let the reel spin. He didn't speak. Didn't even sip his coffee. The tape hissed. The needle flickered. Rain, frogs, the low rumble of clouds turning over. Then gunfire. Not distant. Not a hunter's shot at dusk, but close. 2 cracks, sharp and close enough to rattle the window panes. Baxter leapt from his spot by the hearth and paced, growling low. Walt stood, heart thudding like it hadn't in years. He turned off the machine. Listened. Then nothing. Morning came slow and sullen. The rain had paused. Mist rose from the trees. Across the lake, just above the far shore where the hillside dipped into a patch of old cottonwoods, something glinted. Walt took the binoculars. On the trunk of a wide pine, lodged deep and deliberate, a bullet. Still fresh. Still warm, he guessed. The bark was split clean, like someone had fired at something that never quite appeared. He didn't need a map to know what direction that bullet had come from. The other side of the lake was public land, technically, but it was also where the Harper boys liked to camp when they were out looking for trophies. Everyone in the county knew what that meant. They hunted what they shouldn't, set traps where no tags were issued, bragged too loud in bars. Walter had seen them once, years ago, dragging a chained bear cub out of a ravine. They laughed when it cried. He hadn't forgotten. That afternoon, he took the trail that skirted the lake's bend. The clouds hung low, soaking through his jacket. Baxter stayed close behind, tail low, sniffing often. They passed the edge of the slope where runoff had carved a new line down into the creek bed. Mud slicked the trail, and the rocks underfoot shifted with each step. He wasn't looking for anything, just walking, letting the silence think for him. That's when he saw it. Hollow, standing just beyond the curve of the slope, one arm outstretched, the other braced against a pine. Eyes locked on him, not hiding, not afraid. Its body was covered in mud, fur dark and slick, the injured leg bent slightly. but it stood firm. Walt opened his mouth, said nothing. Hollow stepped forward. Then the ground beneath Walt's feet gave way. It happened fast. Dirt crumbling, boots slipping, the world tilting sideways. He fell hard, shoulder first, slid toward the drop. Roots tore free. Stones clattered down the hill. For one brief second, he felt the edge of it, where ground became air. Then something grabbed him. A hand, a grip, not crushing but steady, pulling, anchoring. Walt felt himself hauled back, inch by inch, as his heartbeat roared in his ears. He gasped when he reached solid ground, coughing dirt and leaves, and looked up. Hollow stood above him, breathing hard, rain dripping from its jaw, chest rising like a bellows. It didn't look heroic, it looked worn, but it had saved him, and then it was gone again. No noise, no breath, just the shape slipping back into the trees like fog returning to water. That night, Walt walked into town for the first time in weeks. The bar was louder than usual. A few locals hunched over tall boys, swapping stories about the sounds in the woods. One man swore he'd seen something moving upright in the distance. Another joked it was just a lost hiker with a fur coat. Walt ordered a coffee, black, and kept his mouth shut. But he listened. In the corner, Harper's voice rose over the buzz, bragging. That's all he ever did. This time, it wasn't about deer or elk. Guy up in Spokane wants proof, he said, tapping his boot on the floor. Not photos, something he can put in a damn cage. Says he'll pay real money for it. Real. The others laughed, but it wasn't friendly. Harper leaned in. We got bait. We got traps. It's only a matter of time. Walt finished his coffee and left without a word. The sky had gone dark, streetlights flickering like tired eyes. As he reached the edge of the lot, he looked back once. Harper was staring at him through the window. No smile, just waiting. Back at the cabin, Walt checked every inch of the perimeter. The traps were gone, cleared out, but that didn't make him feel safer. Baxter stayed close, nose low to the ground. Near midnight, he stepped onto the porch, and there it was, Hollow, standing in the moonlight near the edge of the trees, shoulders still, eyes locked. Walt stepped forward slowly. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, rain dripping from its arms, chest rising slow and heavy. Then it turned and vanished into the fog. No words were needed. It had seen something too, and it had come to say so. August came heavy. The sky thickened like bruised glass, dark even in daylight. Rain hadn't let up in over a week, not really. It poured one day, misted the next, then poured again. Each storm piling over the last like weight on a sagging roof. The creek below the cabin had lost its gentle murmur. Now it roared like something breaking loose. Walter stood by the kitchen window, holding the mug with both hands, watching how the trees leaned harder each morning, how the water had swallowed the old stepping stones down by the dock. Baxter paced more often now. He didn't bark, just walked from room to room, restless, as if something outside the walls had started humming low in his bones. Walt understood that feeling. The quiet before something tears. That night, the wind came first, ripping through the trees like it had forgotten how to be polite. Then a groan rolled through the hills, long and guttural, and the ground seemed to flex beneath the cabin. Walter stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight, boots half-laced, just in time to see the first branch sail across the yard. Rain lashed sideways, and the sky flickered white. Thunder cracked sharp and immediate. Baxter whined and stood at the basement door. That's when Walt remembered. The tapes. He ran back in, grabbed the flashlight and coat, yanked the basement hatch open. The stairs were already slick. He slipped once, caught himself on the railing, heart thumping loud enough to drown the rain. The basement was no more than a dug-out root cellar, lined with stone and old shelving. Water had started seeping in from the corners. Walt rushed to the far end, where the crates sat stacked, reels labeled and cataloged. Years of breath and silence stored on magnetic tape. He started grabbing them by the armload, stuffing them into a duffel. He didn't hear the beam crack. Only when the floor shook and his legs buckled did he realize something above had given. A ceiling joist snapped loose, and the weight of the upstairs pantry came down with it. A sharp crack rang out, followed by a thunderous collapse. Walt twisted too late. The timber pinned his right leg just below the knee. The flashlight skittered across the floor and died. Darkness pressed in. The cold came quick. He gritted his teeth, tried to shift, tried to breathe past the pain. Nothing moved. The beam was solid. His thighs screamed with every attempt. The air turned colder, damper, rising as water filled the cellar inch by inch. At first, it lapped at his boots, then his calves, then his waist. Rain above poured harder, pounding the roof in savage rhythm. He tried calling out once, but the storm swallowed his voice whole. Baxter barked from somewhere above. Short, panicked, then silence. Walt lay back, eyes to the rafters, breathing slow, trying not to let the rising cold choke him. Water surged higher. His fingers went numb. His chest ached. And still, the storm didn't stop. Something upstream had cracked wide open. He could feel it. Maybe the old mining dam. Maybe the ridge finally broke. Whatever it was, the world was flooding now, and no one was coming. Then a noise, a different one. A thump above. A creak of wood, slow and heavy. The hatch burst open. Cold light poured in, and there, crouched in the opening, framed by lightning, was Hollow. The creature looked enormous against the flash. Mud streamed down its back. Its fur clung in wet clumps to the muscle beneath. Its amber eyes locked onto Walt's, and for a moment, neither moved. Then Hollow dropped down into the water. The splash sent waves to the far wall. Walt gasped as the cold rushed higher. Hollow crossed the room in 2 steps. Its hands were slick with dirt and pine needles. It knelt beside him and gripped the beam. Muscles flexed. Wood groaned. It didn't lift it all at once, just rocked it, loosened it, shifted the weight enough for Walter to pull free, howling as his leg dragged through the water. Blood clouded around his boot. He clung to Hollow's arm, chest heaving, as the creature slung him over one shoulder and rose. They climbed, or rather, Hollow climbed, with Walter's weight like nothing. Above ground, the storm howled louder. Rain poured sideways. Lightning split the trees. Hollow carried him up the hill behind the cabin, away from the creek. The flood was chasing them now, fast and dark and full of debris. Fallen trunks, fence posts, tin scraps from the old mining shed. The roar of it made Walt's ears ring. Baxter's bark tore through it all. Sharp, distant, then closer. Hollow set Walt down on a ledge beneath an old outcropping, safe from the current. Walt rolled onto his side, coughing water, pain flaring through his leg. He looked up just in time to see the creature vanish down the slope again. Walt tried to sit up, called out weakly. The wind stole the words. He saw nothing for what felt like forever. Then movement, a shape crashing back through the water. Hollow, and in its arms, Baxter. Soaked, limp. The creature climbed fast, water pushing against its legs, teeth clenched, breath low and ragged. It dropped beside Walt and laid the dog down, then knelt. One massive hand cupped Baxter's chest. The other pressed gently against the ribs, and then it pushed. Once, twice. The dog coughed, gasped, then barked. Walt sobbed. It wasn't loud, just one sound, small, broken, but real. He reached out, hand trembling, and touched Hollow's wrist. The creature didn't flinch, didn't pull away. It just looked at him, eyes deep and tired and old beyond knowing. Walt whispered, "Thank you," not because he expected an answer, but because it needed to be said. The storm raged on, but they didn't move. 3 beings, soaked, shivering, half-broken, breathing. Somewhere in the distance, headlights flickered through the trees. A truck engine growled. then cut out. Walt's eyes tracked the light, Harper's truck. He watched the beams search the wreckage of the valley. But the flood had erased everything. The traps, the paths, even the scars in the land. Gone, swallowed whole. As if the mountain had changed its mind. The lights faded, the rain slowed, and Walt, still half in pain, half in awe, watched Hollow kneel beside the dog again, not like a man, not like a beast, like something between, something ancient. He reached up, rested his hand on its shoulder. It was warm, alive, real, and for the first time in 5 years, Walter Granger didn't feel alone. After the flood, everything shifted. The air hung heavy with damp earth and distant rot, and the forest fell into a hush that didn't lift for days. Walter moved slower, still favoring his injured leg. Baxter limped too, though the vet in town had marveled he'd made it at all. The cabin smelled of drying wood and boiled roots. Hollow hadn't come back. Not directly, not to be seen, but Walt knew it was near. He felt it in the way the crows avoided the tree line, in how Baxter stood facing the woods some nights, ears forward, tail still, like waiting for a whisper only he could hear. Then came the cars. The first was a green Subaru with Washington plates, pulling into the overlook above the lake. Then a white van marked with some unknown podcast logo. Then 3 more trucks. No plates, just mud slick and antennaed. By week's end, they were parking wherever the road bent wide enough. Tents popped up in the meadows. Cameras flashed. Lenses pointed toward the tree line like they were chasing ghosts. The story had gotten out, stretched thin and fed to strangers who wanted spectacle more than truth. Somebody'd heard about the flood. Somebody'd seen Walter limping into town. Somebody claimed a shadow had lifted a man out of the water. Now they all came looking. They asked questions, knocked on his door, left envelopes full of cash offers in the mailbox. Walt didn't answer. He took the batteries out of the recorder, left the porch light off. But he saw them, out there with their parabolic mics and tripods, their long lens fantasies and thermals. He saw how they watched the trees like they expected monsters to be grateful for the attention. Some weren't subtle. Harper wasn't even trying. He showed up again 2 days after the last rain, chewing a toothpick, boots muddy, eyes scanning the ridge like a man with unfinished business. This time he brought gear. Walt watched him from the trees near the ridge. Watched the younger Harper boy set traps again, camouflaged with pine and sap. Watched him carry in a speaker rig, battery-powered, tucked in a dry sack. Walt waited till dusk, then crept down the slope and disabled every single trap. He didn't move the speaker, but he traced the wires back to the switch and snapped them clean. The next night they brought in sound. Walt was sitting by the window, sharpening a blade he no longer used for anything useful, when the noise began. It wasn't natural. It was a high-pitched animal scream, recorded, looped, distorted. A fawn or rabbit maybe, dragged out and played over cheap speakers, echoing up through the trees like a wound that wouldn't clot. Baxter went stiff, then bolted. He shot off the porch like he'd been struck, chasing the sound without hesitation, slipping between the posts of the old fence and into the woods. Walter dropped the blade, grabbed the flashlight, and ran. His leg still wasn't right, but he pushed past the pain, through brambles, over downed limbs. The sound got louder. The forest lit in flashes. Photographers. He crested a ridge and saw them. Dozens now, flashlights cutting through the mist. Men with rifles, women with tripods. A boy in a camouflage hoodie holding a walkie. And then something moved in the clearing. Not Baxter. Something larger. Walter froze. From the edge of the mist, Hollow stepped out. Slow, straight-backed, silent. Its fur caught the light. Slick from the fog, matted from movement. Its breath rose in clouds. Its arms hung low but loose. It didn't look afraid. It didn't look angry. It looked deliberate, like it had chosen this. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. A few lifted phones. One man cocked a rifle. Walter surged forward. "No, don't!" Too late. The forest exploded in voices. People stumbling backward, some trying to film, some too stunned to run. Hollow stood still for one more second, then turned, not away, but toward the far edge of the glade where the light didn't reach. It grabbed a fallen limb, thick as a fence post, and hurled it, not at the people but across their path. It slammed into the trees with a crash like thunder. The effect was instant. Panic scattered the group. Flashlights fell. Someone dropped a camera. Screams turned feral. People ran. Walter pushed through them. Fell once. Got up. Called for Baxter. Then saw Harper. Still standing. Still aiming. His rifle was leveled. Not shaking. Not unsure. And Hollow hadn't moved. Walt stepped between them. "I've got proof," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I've got tape. From the woods. From the flood. I've got bullet casings. I've got the trap you left behind." Harper didn't lower the gun. Walt pulled a tape from his coat pocket. Not a bluff. One from the old reels. He dubbed it clean, added the screech of the trap, the gasping breath of a wounded creature. He held it up. "You fire that shot," he said, "and I take this straight to the Rangers. You'll lose your license. You'll lose everything." Harper's jaw tightened, but he didn't shoot. Behind him, others were listening. One man stepped forward, an older guy, beard graying, boots heavy with creek mud. "You saying this thing saved your life?" Walter nodded. "It pulled me out of the flood, brought my dog back. I owe it more than I owe any of you." Silence fell over the clearing. Some lowered their cameras. A woman sobbed softly. Harper spat into the grass, shouldered his rifle, and turned. "Bunch of damn fools," he muttered, and disappeared into the trees. One by one they followed. The flashlights faded. The forest breathed again, and Hollow stood alone. Walter turned to face it. No fear now, just a quiet understanding between them. He clapped twice. Soft. "Steady." Hollow lowered its head, brought one hand to its chest, and tapped twice in return. Then it turned, and vanished into the mist without a sound. That night the forest slept deeply. Walter sat on the porch with Baxter curled beside him, dry now, breath even. The rain didn't come. No flashlights wandered. No cars climbed the hill. He looked out at the dark and whispered something the trees would keep. "Go on, be free." And somewhere, beneath the pine and moonlight, something ancient did. Fall returned like a hush. The first cold night came without warning, slipped under the door frames and curled around the chimney bricks before the fire was ready. Leaves went gold almost overnight, and then brown even faster. The lake quieted. The fog that once hid the creature now clung gently to the surface like breath on old glass. And inside the cabin, time moved slower than it had in years. Walter had started recording again, not for study, not for safekeeping, just to speak. His voice had changed, rougher but softer too, less interested in being understood, more willing to sit in silence between the words. He kept the old Nagra running most nights, the reels turning steady beside him as he lay wrapped in 2 wool blankets and listened to the creak of the roof beams, the shifting of the dog beside his bed, the wind across the lake like someone dragging a hand across water too cold to touch. He knew the signs, the fatigue that didn't go away, the shortness of breath that snuck in while tying a boot or climbing a single step, the quiet palpitations that kept time with the rain. His heart wasn't holding the way it used to. He didn't need a doctor to tell him. His chest had grown full, not with fear, but with a kind of final peace. He had made it longer than he expected to, long enough to see something no one believed and to love it without needing to cage it. Long enough to say goodbye right. The recorder clicked once, then twice. He leaned in and spoke like he was whispering to the trees. "If one day I fall silent," he said, "don't be afraid of it. Don't fear the quiet. It's not the same thing as being alone. Go where the water runs clear, where the trees lean together, where the wind still sings. I'll be listening. I promise." He paused, let the silence hold it, then turned off the machine. Baxter stirred, stretched, and let out a low, sleepy sigh. Walter reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. His hand shook a little, not from cold, from memory. Outside, frost had kissed the ground for the first time that season. The boards creaked as he opened the door, stepping out onto the porch with a wool shawl around his shoulders and the night pressing close. The stars were faint, half veiled by clouds, and the moon sat low and amber, hanging like an old lantern at the edge of the sky. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Heavy, rhythmic, measured. They didn't crash or stomp. They weren't creeping either. They simply arrived. Like something that had walked that path 1,000 times in darkness, knowing exactly where the moss grew thick and the stones didn't shift. Walter stood still. No weapon, no flashlight, just the old shawl and the old dog beside him. And then the creature stepped forward. Not out of hiding, but out of silence. The moon caught its face. That same human-like wild man face that had stayed in Walt's dreams since that first night by the lake. The fur was darker now, thick for winter, but the eyes were the same, amber and sad and kind. Beneath the eyes, faint scars from the old trap. On its shoulders, the wet shine of pine needles. They stared at each other a long while. No one moved. Then Walt raised his hand and clapped. Twice. Soft, clear. The creature paused, then brought its hand to its chest, and struck it once, then once more. The echo was quieter this time, but it reached the heart just the same. Walter didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to explain. The world had already shifted. Hollow turned, not in haste, just in understanding, then melted back into the tree line without a sound. By morning, the porch boards were dry, but something else sat on the top step. The metal tag, Harker Ranch ID. Only now, it was clean, washed. The edges wiped smooth like someone had run a thumb across it for hours. The mud was gone. The rust had faded. It gleamed faint in the early sun. Walt bent slowly and picked it up, turned it once in his palm, felt its weight, then went inside and set it on the table. He pulled out a manila envelope from the drawer and began to write. It wasn't a letter. Not exactly. It was instructions, coordinates to the property lines, a map, an annotated list of where the old traps used to sit, notes on wildlife patterns, old hunting paths, locations of storm runoff. He labeled them all by hand. Then he wrote one line at the top of the page. Proposal. Granger Preserve, private stewardship zone. Below it, he wrote a single sentence. For what lives, for what listens, and for what may never be named. He signed his name, folded the page, slipped it into the envelope with the tag, then sealed it. 2 days later, a Forest Service ranger came knocking. Walt handed him the envelope without a word. The young man read the label, nodded, and tipped his cap. Neither one needed to say much. That night, the recorder sat still. The fireplace crackled. Baxter lay curled tight, eyes fluttering in half-sleep. Walt climbed into bed slow, tucked the blankets under his chin. He didn't reach for the recorder. He didn't need to. The breath in his chest had grown quiet. Not weak, just calm. The wind rose around the cabin, soft, familiar. And in that hush of night, Walter Granger slipped away like the end of a song no one realized had finished. No struggle, no fanfare. Just stillness. Baxter stayed beside him until morning. Didn't bark, didn't move, only raised his head once, as if hearing something deep in the woods, then lay it back down. The cabin didn't change, the porch didn't creak. But in the woods, far out past the bend, where the mist rises from the lake like memory, something stirred. Something tall and silent stood in the clearing with its hand over its chest, waiting. And in the distance, through fog and frost, 2 quiet knocks answered back. By the time winter came around the bend again, the cabin stood still under a pale sky, half dusted with early snow, half wrapped in fog. No one lived there anymore, but it didn't feel empty. The wind still circled the chimney like it knew someone was home. The porch boards creaked on cold mornings. The lake behind the tree line held its breath in the quiet. And inside, behind the dusty glass window. The old tape recorder sat exactly where Walter had left it. Reels still threaded, still waiting. It was almost a year since he'd passed. Quietly, without ceremony. Baxter had held on through the spring, through most of summer, until one morning in August when he lay down beside the porch step and never got back up. The forest ranger who came by every few weeks found him there, eyes closed, head turned slightly toward the woods, like he'd heard something call his name just before leaving. They buried him under the porch, in the soft slope where Walter used to sit with his coffee and watch the fog drift across the lake. By September, the land around Silver Creek was officially designated Granger Preserve. The sign went up just past the first turnoff from the logging road. A cedar plank sanded smooth, burned letters carved by hand. Granger Preserve. For all who listen. People came for the dedication. Not many. Just enough. A few locals who'd known Walter from the post office or gas pump. The ranger who took over his mail. The woman from the station who'd filed the land request. One kid from town who swore he'd seen a giant figure in the trees when he was 10 and still talked about it like it had happened last week. They brought folding chairs and thermoses, wore their good flannel and snow boots. When the ribbon was cut, just a piece of red cloth strung between two poles, they played something unexpected. Not a speech, not a song, just a tape. Walt's last one. His voice came through grainy at first, a little breathless, like he was already halfway gone, but still holding on just enough to leave something behind. "If one day I fall silent," the recording said, "don't be afraid of it. Don't fear the quiet. It's not the same thing as being alone." Then, for a while, nothing, only the hiss of the tape, the sound of a breeze outside his cabin, the clicking of the stove in the background, the soft thump of a dog shifting his weight. And then, 2 knocks. Low, deep, deliberate. Not from Walter. Not from a man. From something larger, something older. Nobody spoke when the tape clicked off. Nobody asked who had added it. It wasn't edited, wasn't engineered, just there, as if the forest itself had answered him. Later that evening, when the sun dipped behind the ridge and the last of the crowd packed up their chairs and left over coffee, the ranger stayed behind. She walked the trail once, all the way down to the edge of the lake. It was quiet there, still. Her boots left no prints, just faint dents in the soft moss. She paused at the shoreline, looked across to the far bank where the trees bunched tighter, and thought she saw movement just beyond the reeds. A shadow, a shape. Gone too fast to be sure. But she didn't feel fear, just something deeper, a kind of reverence. Back at the cabin, the porch light still worked. The solar panel was cracked but held enough charge to flicker on at dusk. They left it that way, always on. Not for people, for the path, for the ones who returned by instinct, not direction. And they did return, not often, not when watched, but signs showed up. Every full moon or so, someone walking the lake trail found something at the steps of the porch. A braid of dried reeds, a flat stone marked with ash, a pine branch carefully bent, and once a single clump of silver-gray fir, soft as breath, left beside a carved piece of bark with 2 parallel notches cut deep. Each time the ranger noted it, logged it, took no samples. She just wrote, "Gift left, sign of presence, no threat, no damage, cabin undisturbed." Some people asked her if it was just kids messing around. She didn't argue. She just nodded. But the old dog's grave never stayed bare. Every few weeks it was found covered with dried grass, clover mostly, the same kind Hollow had once offered to Baxter on a cold night in spring. Not as food, but as comfort, as warmth. The grave never went untouched long. Inside the cabin, Walter's belongings stayed mostly untouched. A few items were boxed, sent to a niece in Boise he hadn't spoken to in years. But the ranger left the rest. The shelves of field tapes, the coat by the door, the boots by the hearth, the pine cones lined up on the sill, and on the table, in a small wooden box, the tag, Harker Ranch, ID. But now it was wrapped in something else, a strip of leather, worn, cracked, with two tiny knots tied into it, one near each end. The kind of thing someone might tie around the neck of an animal, or a friend, or a memory. No one touched it after that, not because of fear, because it felt finished, like it had found its place. And yet, the forest never really lets go of a voice like Walter's. There were stories still. Campers who swore they heard breathing in the trees when no one was around. Fishermen who found larger-than-human footprints near the edge of the stream, only to have them washed away before they could take a photo. A teenager who once claimed she saw something watching her from the ridgeline, then vanished behind a fir tree that never moved. No one filed reports. Nobody brought cameras anymore. Not since they realized it wasn't about seeing something. It was about hearing it, feeling it, letting it stay wild. At night, when the wind rises through the Granger preserve and passes between the trees just right, it doesn't sound like wind anymore. It sounds like breath, like water and wood and heartbeat tangled into one. Some say it's the forest remembering him. Some say it's him, still listening. Others believe it's something older, still walking, still waiting, still laying grass at the foot of an old porch because of a kindness shown one rainy day in spring. And the story of the man, the dog, and the creature without a name? It never made the papers. But it's still told, in low voices, by firelight, with pauses, with reverence. Because not all legends ask to be chased. Some only ask to be left in peace, so they can echo forever. In the end, stories like this remind us of something we often forget in the rush of our daily lives. That not all miracles come with noise, and not all truths need to be proven to be real. Sometimes, the most powerful connections are the quiet ones, built not with words, but with presence, with time, with shared silence. They take root in places where fear could have grown, and instead, something gentler rises. Recognition, compassion, understanding without the need to explain. This was never about monsters or legends or something to be captured in a photo. It was about something far more human. About how loss doesn't always have to mean emptiness. How healing sometimes comes not in answers, but in the act of choosing to stay, to listen, to protect what we don't fully understand. About how even in the loneliest corners of the world, kindness can find its way forward like light slipping through the trees at dawn. Quiet, but unstoppable. There's something deeply human about reaching across the boundaries we create. Between species, between strangers, between our past and who we are now. Because we all carry something we're not ready to let go of. And sometimes it takes something wild and wordless to hold a mirror to that ache and not run from it. We live in a world that often demands proof before belief. But maybe some things aren't meant to be proven. Maybe they're meant to be felt. Maybe the most meaningful stories are the ones whispered, not shouted. The ones that ask us to lean in closer, to pay attention, to see with something deeper than sight. With heart. And maybe, if we're lucky, we'll remember that real strength isn't always in standing tallest or shouting loudest, but in choosing compassion when it's hardest, in protecting what's fragile, not because it serves us, but because it matters, in recognizing that some beings, some moments, are sacred simply because they exist. So as the story fades into the trees and the final echoes settle into the moss and stone, we're left with this simple truth. The forest listens, and if we're still enough, if we're quiet enough, we might hear it answer. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story touched something in you, if it made you feel, remember, or simply pause, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe. If you'd like more stories that breathe, that linger, and that speak softly to the parts of us that never really stop listening. Until next time, take care of the wildness within you and keep listening.